So bin 201, I think we can start. So distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second webinar of the Work Cycle 2025-2026 of the UNCTAD Informal Working Group on Consumer Protection in E-commerce. My name is Valentina Rivas, and I am a Program Management Officer at the Competition and Consumer Policies branch of UNCTAD. And together with Christine, we coordinate this working group. Under the work program of this year, member states have decided to discuss dynamic prices under the stream work line on emerging issues in digital consumer protection. Today, we are here to set the stage for a discussion on the rise of dynamic and algorithmic pricing in digital markets, its implications for consumer fairness and transparency, and the challenges it poses for enforcement authorities worldwide. Allow me to introduce our distinguished speakers who are at the forefront of this transformative topic. We have with us Mateusz Grochowski, Associate Professor of Law of the Tulane University School of Law; Simon Jones, Project Director of the Competition and Market Authority of the United Kingdom; we have Grace Gage, Policy Analyst, Artificial Intelligence from Consumer Reports of the United States of America; and Eric Garden from More Perfect Union. And we also have with us Els Brugman, Head of Policy on Enforcement and Communication of Euroconsumers. The moderation today will be handled by Professor Christine Rifa, the Academic Coordinator of the Informal Working Group on Consumer Protection in E-commerce. Before I hand the floor to Professor Rifa, let me mention that UNCTAD is the focal point on consumer protection issues within the United Nations system and is the guardian of the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection. The United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection that were revised in 2015 to contain a specific section on e-commerce. And the guidelines recommend that member states should work towards enhancing consumer confidence in e-commerce by the continued development of transparent and effective consumer protection policies, ensuring a level of protection that is not less than the one afforded in other forms of commerce. This webinar is being organized in the framework, as we said, of the UNCTAD Informal Working Group on Consumer Protection in E-commerce, and this working group was convened as a request by the Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Consumer Protection in 2017 to highlight best practices and to facilitate information exchange and consultations. So today we have the opportunity to delve into a compelling and highly relevant subject, one that resonates not only with the topic of electronic commerce, consumer protection, and competition, but also attracts the attention of every internet shopper, and this is dynamic pricing. So without further ado, Christine, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Valentina, and welcome to everyone to this webinar. I just wanted to briefly situate what we're doing today within the wider work that the working group has been undertaking. So for the last 2 years, we spent most of our time in the working group looking at artificial intelligence and the impact it may have on consumer protection. The focus was very much on the role of enforcement agencies and how they needed to harness the technology in order to be able to combat unfair practices online. Today, we are turning our attention away from what agencies can do institutionally, and we are going to put the spotlight back on the risks for consumers and how to handle them. The work on rolling out technology in enforcement agencies culminated with 2 main documents that are now publicly available. Not only the technical notes on consumer protection and artificial intelligence, but also a checklist for enforcement agencies wanting to roll out such tools within their enforcement portfolio. So without further ado, I will hand over to our speakers speakers as we explore dynamic pricing today. Now, dynamic pricing is a title or an expression that doesn't really have a legal definition, that can be interpreted in slightly different ways. So maybe I will let each speakers explain how they have conceptualized the term. But in effect, I think we can probably say that it's a flexible strategy that businesses tend to adopt to adjust prices in order to get from customers the best price they can. It's effectively some principles that most economists will recognize. It's actually making sure that you can maximize what you can charge to consumers at any given moment. That issue became very prominent and is still very prominent and developing. So we will hand over the floor to Matthias, who's been looking at this from an academic perspective. We will then hear from Simon Jones at the CMA, who will give us the way an enforcement authority has tackled some of the issues. And then we'll move to the consumer side to hear from two experiences and some actions from that side of the market and what can be done and what should be done. And hopefully we'll be having time for questions. Please do put your questions in a Q&A whilst the speakers are talking. This will be monitored. Good. I can see that the slides have come up for Matthias to take the floor. So Matthias Grosowski from Chilean University School of Law, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Christina. Thank you for the invitation to this webinar. I think the topic couldn't be selected in a better and more timely way because, as you probably all know, we are living in the era of big data and we are living in the era of algorithms in the consumer economy, and the meeting of those two phenomena, amongst other things, created also an unprecedented opportunity for many businesses, for many firms in the consumer economy to set up prices in a way that for a long time, and again, this is something that Christine already mentioned, that for a long time have been some kind of like a ideal dream of economists. So the setting in which we have information about every client, about groups of clients, and we can measure, at least try to measure, the needs, the preferences, the vulnerabilities of those clients, and we can more or less precisely understand what is the reservation price. So in other terms, like in the non-economic language, what is the highest price that the current client is able to or willing to pay in the current moment for the particular product or service. And from this perspective, we can think about consumer prices on a spectrum, as you can see on a slide right now. So on the one side, we have prices that are entirely fixed. And this is something we have been familiar with for decades in the consumer economy, at least since like the beginning of the 20th century, when fixed prices started to dominate the consumer market. So we go to a store, to like a brick and mortar store, and we get the price that was set for the particular product in advance. And this price does not change, at least does not change quickly. If it changes for the entire product, not for the particular consumers. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have prices that are entirely personalized. So prices that are set for one particular consumer for the one particular product in the particular moment. And in between, you can see this question mark, and the question mark are all the prices that are like along the spectrum and that are to some extent diversified for particular consumers, for particular groups, but not always for individual consumers and not always for one particular product, or not always only depending on the personal features of those consumers. And what we can see in between can be defined as dynamic/personalized prices. As Christine Rifa said at the beginning, we are having the whole spectrum of terminology in this regard. For the sake of this presentation, I would tend to call personalized prices as prices that were set for individual consumers. The dynamic prices are the prices that are changing over time, but not necessarily for the individual consumers as such. And to illustrate this difference, you can see two pictures on the slide. So on the left side, you can see something that I think can more or less illustratively depict what are the personalized, what are the dynamic prices. So when you think about the airline prices are changing depending on the demand and supply curve. So how many acquisitions of tickets were made, it can directly influence how high the price for the next consumers for the particular ticket will be, but also some objective factors like how close are we to the date of the flight. You know that the sooner we buy the tickets, normally the lower the price for the ticket is, which eventually may mean that on the same flight, each of the passengers will pay a slightly different price for the same flight, even for the same seat. And on the right side, you can see something that I think is a very nice depiction of what personalized prices can mean, because in many parts of the industry where you make particular orders using your smartphone or any other mobile device, the firm that operates a particular app, and it's true for many ride-sharing apps, like for example, Uber or Lyft, can collect information not only about you, not only about your online activity, but also about your device, including the information about how much of the battery life is left for your device. And with this information, there's a pretty high probability, given the empirical studies that have been run over the past years, is used in order to determine how determined you are, how much in need of the particular service, for example, a ride on Uber you are. And if your smartphone battery is, for example, on 20%, you are evaluated as somebody who can wait, who can, for example, browse between offers, which means that the price for you can be slightly lower. If your battery is almost to die, which this may suggest that you are in a much higher need of the particular service, and the price for the service can be higher, because if you don't get the particular Uber ride, your phone will die and you will not be able to get any ride at all. So dynamic versus personalized, more objective versus more personal, more individualized factors. And now, why are we having problems with the personalized/dynamic prices? Because in both settings, the main factor that determines the price is the data, in particular the personal data of consumers, which means that prices are differentiated between consumers, which opens up a lot of discussion about discrimination, about unequal treatment of consumers, about exploitation of vulnerabilities of consumers and pricing, for example, consumers that have older devices or devices with shorter battery life on a higher level than the consumers who are in a less dire need of the particular service. Secondly, this is of course the question of surveillance. So the question to what extent we should build on sometimes very intimate, very sensitive data of consumers, like for example, data about the family life, about the health status, about the family, about the age and gender, as the factors that should determine the price of the particular good or product for the particular consumer. And thirdly, this is the question of automation. So the price is being set by the machine, is being set in the unilateral way. There is no bargaining. There is no possibility to talk with the human agent and to try to understand why the price was set in the particular way and what I can do to make the price lower and so far. And this, of course, leads to a number of questions related to not only market power and antitrust issues, because this is one huge question related to price personalization, but also to more precisely consumer-specific aspects. So apart from discrimination that I mentioned and the use of vulnerabilities, we have the question of privacy protection. So to what extent I should have control over the data that is used for price personalization. There is the question of price collusion, because we have, again, a lot of empirical evidence that algorithms used to set prices can collude between each other. So they look into what the other algorithms on the market are doing. And for example, if you have a few companies, a few firms in the same market sector, each of them applying personalized pricing, the algorithms can effectively raise the prices in the scale of the entire market, because each algorithm will try to outperform the other algorithms in the particular market sector. And finally, of course, we have the question of exploitation. Again, as Christina said at the beginning, the main point of the entire personalized pricing activity, practice, is to increase the prices on the consumer market, is to make consumers pay on average more, is to hit the right reservation price for the consumers, and to collect something that economists call the consumer surplus. So like additional portion of the price that the consumer can be offered without discouraging this consumer from making the purchase. And what are we trying to do about it? So there's a lot of debate right now about personalized pricing on the one side. On the other side, we are having some very initial regulatory attempts to grapple with the problem of price personalization. And one of them, and probably like the dominant one you can observe across the world, is the disclosure. Now on the slide, you can see a very recent law enacted in the state of New York, which mandates all the companies that use algorithmic pricing, algorithmic price personalization, to include a prominent note to consumers saying that this price was set by an algorithm using your personal data. A very similar approach can be found in a slightly older directive. So this is the so-called Omnibus Directive of the European Union of 2019, where you also have a general duty to disclose the fact that the price was personalized for you. And when you, for example, buy airline tickets in European Union, sometimes you can find like a small note somewhere on the website saying that this price was personalized. But of course, disclosure, and I'm sure you are aware of the general problems of disclosure that we observe in the consumer economy. In this particular concept, in this particular instance of disclosure, apart from information overflow, apart from the no-reading problem, we have some particular specific doubts that are raised in the literature and policy discussion about whether this kind of disclosure is in fact effective. Because first of all, what kind of use consumers can make of the fact that they know that the price was personalized if they have no meaningful choice, if they cannot, for example, opt out of the personalized price and get the non-personal price, or switch between companies. Like if we want to order an Uber ride and we are unhappy with the price, we can switch to another company, another app, but another app will also personalize us and set us the individual price. Of course, consumers are in general unhappy about being personalized. And again, there is an abundance of the empirical evidence about it. But at the same time, it's very hard to understand what other types of information might be more useful for consumers. There are some attempts to regulate, or at least to make some policy proposals. For example, that consumers should be informed about non-personal average price of the particular good or service, or the average price offered to consumers for the particular service over the last week or month. But again, this is something that we are still starting to talk about. We are at the very beginning of the discussion. And finally, consumers must be able to understand what is happening in the area of price personalization in order to better grasp, for example, disclosures like the disclosures in the European Union or in the New York. And in order to achieve this, we do not need only the disclosure, but also more profound, more robust consumer education. This is the moment where I would like to stop. I'm very much looking forward to your questions, and I will be happy to expand more on what I just said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthias, and fantastic to keep the time. Thank you. So we now have heard a little bit more about what the concept is and what it is and what kind of policy responses or legal responses could be brought to the problem that it may pose. We are now going to turn to an enforcement agency, the CMA in the UK, who has tackled this problem quite recently, to see how they have dealt with the issue. So Simon Jones, the floor is yours. We'll take questions. Sorry, I should say, put the questions in your Q&A and we'll take questions all at the end for all the speakers. So if you want to ask a question of a specific speaker, please put who it is directed to. Thank you. Simon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. And also thank you very much, Valentina, for inviting me to speak today. It's an absolute pleasure to meet everybody. So I'm going to talk about dynamic pricing, really, from the perspective that I have as the CMA's project director for a short and actually quite informal piece of work that we did on dynamic pricing in late 2024 and early 2025. We looked at the consequences of dynamic pricing for consumers, businesses, and markets. And I should say that while I'm in the consumer protection team at the CMA, our project wasn't solely a consumer project. We wanted to take a balanced view of the pros and cons of dynamic pricing for businesses and consumers. So this project on dynamic pricing was a companion piece to a formal investigation the CMA did into the sale by Ticketmaster of tickets for the Oasis reunion concerts. You may all be familiar with that. You may have gone to some of the concerts. You may also then be familiar with the concerns expressed by many people at the time, including our Prime Minister, about those ticket sales and the prices that were charged. In the end, we concluded that Oasis tickets hadn't been sold by dynamic pricing, so I'm not going to talk any more about that. When I say our dynamic pricing project was informal, it's because we didn't use compulsory powers to obtain evidence. Instead, we identified a number of sectors where dynamic pricing was in use, and we tried to speak to businesses across those sectors, trying to reach those with different business models about what they did. And the sectors we focused on were airlines, hotels, events, leisure, rail, retail, and what I have learned to call ride-hailing. That's firms like Uber. And at the end of the project, we published a short note outlining some of the main issues and some do's and don'ts from a consumer protection perspective. And I think Valentina may post that note just so you can all read it and quiz me about it afterwards. Right. So some observations from me on the work. First of all, Christine introduced this note introduced this session by saying definitions were interesting. I would say throughout the project that I did, people were more than interested. They were fascinated by definitions. We quickly established, as Christine mentioned, that there isn't a commonly agreed definition of dynamic pricing. My focus on the project was trying to get us to look mainly at what was actually happening in markets, but people kept trying to get me to come up with a definition, and we did in the end. We considered several different approaches to how we would define it. We thought about looking at dynamic pricing from the perspective of the consumer experience, perhaps of prices changing while consumers were considering a purchase, and the period in which consumers are considering a purchase can be long or short. But I think dynamic pricing is a business practice, and it seems sensible to take a business-centered approach. Businesses, of course, had very different views on what dynamic pricing was, and still less on whether they were actually doing it. Although, well, I say all, perhaps I should really say almost all, agreed that whatever they were doing was in some sense, a response to changes in demand. So the definition we came up with, and you'll see it in the note that Valentina has posted, is essentially to say that dynamic pricing is what happens when firms adjust prices rapidly and frequently in response to changing demand. Now, I think many economists and businesses would see the strength of this. We say in our note that it reflects the motivation that businesses have for adopting dynamic pricing, and I think that was certainly reflected in the comments that all businesses made to us. It's certainly true. The only thing I would add, though, is that what firms do when they set prices in dynamic pricing varies. So I'm drawing a distinction now between why they do dynamic pricing to respond to changes in demand and what they actually do when they set prices dynamically. And here I think you should be aware that firms have very different practices. Some firms, it's true, set prices based essentially on the change in demand for their product in response to changes in demand. But others, especially those with very sophisticated revenue management capabilities, set prices that reflect more than just the change in demand for their project. For example, they may reflect changes in their competitors' prices. So I'd also add two other things. First of all, when we say rapidly and frequently, what is rapid and frequent will vary from sector to sector. And secondly, we didn't think an algorithm was necessary for there to be dynamic pricing. In many very sophisticated revenue management systems, algorithms are used extensively. But even then, we found that firms often wanted a human to take the final decision on the level of prices. And I think that was often for reputational reasons. Right, so much for the definition. What is happening then in markets and what are its effects? So I think our starting point was that rational firms want to maximize their profits. And we think they will adopt dynamic pricing where it helps them to do that. And that's not something, obviously, that we take issue with. Many businesses told us that dynamic pricing has helped them to maximize revenues in the face of fluctuating demand. And this is most obviously true where they are subject to high fixed costs or capacity constraints. Many of the markets in the UK where we observe dynamic pricing have fixed levels of capacity that cannot be changed. In others, it's very expensive to change capacity. And a good example of this are airlines and hotels, and to a lesser extent, trains and live events. And where a product is what we termed perishable, in the sense that it cannot be sold after a certain point of time. And a good example is a hotel room that has to be sold on a night-by-night basis. Dynamic pricing may help businesses to make the most use of their fixed capacity, in this case, hotel rooms. So varying prices in this way can also help consumers, we think. Where capacity is fixed, dynamic pricing can smooth demand by signaling through increased prices that consumers may want to consider different and potentially cheaper options. And lower prices for alternative options or services will help consumers to make choices that reflect the prices they are prepared to pay, while also increasing the extent to which capacity is filled. And I think, I look at this, and we would look at this, as efficient matching of supply with demand. In the case of, for example, visitors to a theme park, spreading the footfall across the day or week may also enhance visitors' enjoyment. Those who may want to attend the theme park at the most popular time are more likely to get a ticket at that time, because those who are more able to be flexible about the day and time will have got access at a cheaper price. So that tends to reflect the situation where capacity is fixed, where supply is more, where capacity is fixed, where supply is more flexible. Dynamic pricing can play a very important role in equalizing demand and supply. This is best illustrated by platforms such as those in the ride-hailing sector, which use price increases to encourage more capacity onto the market, typically putting more cars and drivers on the street at times of high demand. And these may be antisocial working times if you live in London, after theatres close in the evening when it's pouring with rain. And of course, it may also, putting the prices up may also suppress demand. So there is a sort of two-way demand and supply equalizing mechanism there. So what I think we probably thought is that dynamic pricing is likely to have the strongest potential benefits for consumers as well as businesses, where either it leads to a change in demand in the face of capacity constraints, or it leads to an increase in supply where supply is flexible. On the one hand, the airline example, on the other hand, the Uber example. But where such capacity problems are less obvious, I think then businesses may need to do more to explain how benefits may arise and how those benefits are shared with businesses and consumers. Now, competition is also a factor in here, and obviously with the Competition and Markets Authority, this is very interesting to us. Dynamic pricing is more likely to benefit consumers as well as businesses where there is sufficient competition to ensure that efficiency benefits are in fact passed through into lower prices rather than being retained as higher profits over the longer term. So, there are lots of other considerations for consumers and for markets. Firms told us that the consumer experience of prices and dynamic pricing is likely to be that of prices going up over time. Lack of transparency about pricing can affect customers in their product searches and at the point at which they commit to a purchase. Healthy markets need consumers to be able to make informed choices about goods or services that are best for them. And when consumers can't effectively compare prices to determine which product is best, it may hinder their ability to stimulate healthy competition between competitors. Now, we're not perfectionists about markets. Perfect price transparency may not be realistic in markets, and it can also involve other trade-offs, in particular as a risk of information overload, I think. But changing prices, particularly where they change frequently or significantly, can lead to consumer distrust and the feeling that consumers are not being treated fairly or getting good value for money. So to conclude, sorry, Valentina, I hope this is more or less in time. This is in the note, but I'll just read what it says. We are most likely to be concerned about the use of dynamic pricing when consumers are unaware that it's being used or how it may affect prices, so they can't make informed choices, where they feel pressured to make quick decisions because prices may rise suddenly, where vulnerable consumers pay higher prices than others. And vulnerable may, in some senses, be extended here to include those who are not technologically savvy. And obviously where it's used to obtain or maintain market power or reduce new entry in a market, which is obviously going to exacerbate problems of lack of competition, higher prices, lower output, and so on. So I'll stop there. Hope that's just about within the time limit.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon, for this very interesting study that was actually carried out at a time where not many people were worrying about dynamic pricing. There's been before you quite a lot of concern about personalised pricing, but I think that was marking a different step in what was possible. So we're now going to turn to the consumer side by listening to a very interesting presentation, no doubt, from Grace and Eric, who worked together to look at some price experiments. And it would be interesting, I think, having heard what we have so far, to reflect on what is happening and whether or not we see a lot of evidence for this pricing being actually troublesome for consumers. So Grace and Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having us here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Well, wonderful. Nice to meet everyone here. My name is Eric Gardner. I'm a reporter with More Perfect Union, and my colleague Grace Getty, who is with Consumer Reports, and will handle kind of the policy side here. This study here that we did, this investigation, was a collaboration between Consumer Reports, More Perfect Union, and Groundwork Collaborative. And it really set out to answer the question, does Instacart charge different people different amounts for the same items at the same store? It all kind of originated from Katie Wells, who at the time was with Groundwork Collaborative. She was a researcher who had done some investigations into how Instacart was pricing its workers, its delivery drivers, the wages that it was offered them. And she found some pretty strong evidence that they were basically different amounts for the same work. And so she posed the question, are they doing this? If they're doing this to workers, what potentially are they doing to consumers? Adding to kind of the intrigue on this, in 2022, Instacart, which is who folks that don't know, it's a grocery delivery app, acquired a firm called Eversight, which is an AI testing company in 2022. AI price testing company, I should say. So we set out to really test this, and this was kind of the methodology that our project used. We recruited 437 volunteers over essentially 5 different tests. They would log into kind of a controlled experiment, a Zoom meeting just like this, where they would walk through and they would select the same store, and we're all at the same time, the same 20 products, screenshot everything, and then submit it into the team. Again, there was 5 controlled experiments. We identified, we did 3 Safeway locations, which is a large grocer here on both the east and west coast of America, and then Target, which is another large retailer. And again, it's all around the same time, the same items. Participants took those screenshots, but they didn't purchase. That's one key aspect. And then they submitted into the team, which then Katie Wells and the Consumer Reports team meticulously went through every single screenshot and validated that it was the right cards, the right prices, or not the right prices, but the right items. So what did that reveal? Well, really systemic price discrimination across the platform. So what we found was about 3/4 of all products that were selected had multiple prices. And there was up to 5 different prices simultaneously. So for an example, on one experiment, a dozen eggs would cost anywhere between $3.99 and $4.79, showing about a 20% spread from the lowest to the highest price. We found it with store brand cornflakes as well. And again, about 3/4 of all products had different prices. The interesting spot or thing that we found was that we saw some level of, or we saw basically price bucketing. So shoppers were sorted into 4 to 8 different tiers for store, and I'll give a visual example of that on the next slide. But basically, when you get into the app, you're just slotted into a certain tier, and you get the prices, the same one. Everyone in that tier get the same prices for every item. And the spreads there are, can be pretty large. In the Washington example, I believe the lowest prices for the 20 items was about $115, and it goes up to about $125. We also saw evidence of fictitious pricing. So what that is just same sale price. So you're seeing your final net price, but a different original prices to kind of create the illusion of a sale. As I say in this example here, saltines are $3.99, but some people may see just $3.99 or sometimes originally $6.69. And again, kind of the overall impact, average basket variation was about 7%. 92% of shoppers paid more than the lowest price. So that lowest price wasn't kind of the standard. And then if you project that out, comes out to be about $1,200 per household. And again, here is the kind of the example of the price groups. So about some of the shoppers were in that first price group at about 114, and then the next was about 124. So I misspoke there. It's 114 then to 124. But as you can see, it kind of creates a somewhat of a normal distribution. So we reached out to Instacart for comment, and what we got back was essentially that these are random tests, randomly assigned the price test cohorts by category and location. None of this is based off of any kind of personal or demographic data, because there's kind of a delineation here as we're talking about algorithmic pricing or dynamic pricing or surveillance pricing. Surveillance pricing is this idea that kind of your past purchasing behavior will help dictate prices. They claim that that's not what was happening there. One interesting thing is that Derek Kravitz at Consumer Reports found really an extensive patent portfolio from Instacart and Eversight that describes explicit references to basically segmenting customers by purchase history, buying behavior, demographics, even something called product and shopper headroom, which are essentially how much a store thinks you're willing to spend on an item. So again, Instacart denies that has any impact on the prices seen. There's a couple additional caveats here. We do know that Instacart purchases data from 2 major data brokers here in the States, and they have admitted that brands can use that behavioral data described in the patents for targeted offer or promotions. So kind of your buy one, get ones or buy one, get 10% off type thing. They admit to using that information to influence what offers are coming through. And then again, Instacart pointed out that, their patents are broad to preserve kind of optionality. So this is, I guess, just wanted to highlight one of the interesting parts of this investigation was a lot of the claims just kind of fell apart or didn't match what we found. So Instacart has been consistent about this in their public statements before and after the investigation, that these are tests that the retail partners use on their platform, that they're controlling the prices. What we found in our investigation was that Target has no official relationship with Instacart. They're not on Instacart. Instacart admitted that they're scraping Target's website for their prices and then running their own pricing test. So it raises the question, are retail partners actually controlling these tests? They claim they have 10 retail partners. And again, we found that are using this software. We found, that they were working at Target, which has no partnership. And also one thing to point out is that their retail partners make up a large share of grocery market in the U.S. Most see standard prices, another thing they said. What we found, 92% paid more than the lowest price. And then one of the big things is they argue that these are kind of small changes trying to figure out the elasticity of demand here. And just, again, kind of a $1,200 a year potential impact. And one kind of interesting part of this investigation was towards the end of it, Consumer Reports ran some additional tests just to try to figure out what retailers were potentially using this. And one of them was Costco, which is a large kind of warehouse style grocery market here in the States. And in responding to requests for comment, they inadvertently forwarded internal communications to the team, which described it as smart rounding, which is kind of their name. We found one reference to it in their public statements, which described it as machine learning to basically improve price performance, or price perception, I should say. And an easy way to understand that and how it was explained to us is that, let's say an item is on sale for $5.95. There might be some psychological factor where if you raise it to $5.97, a consumer thinks that's a better deal and buys more. That's kind of how it was explained to us. The problem with that is that the evidence and the tests that were done showed 10% price differences. So it doesn't really track with these small psychological impacts when it's a 10% gap there. After the investigation was revealed to the public, Instacart did claim to end all price experiments on the platform. This is just kind of another caveat here. I know this is digital market, but kind of the question was, does it expand into physical stores? So Instacart has these things called carrot tags, which basically connects their software pricing and experimental system to electronic shelf labels, which I know are pretty popular over in Europe, but just coming here to the States. We found, so we'll just jump to the bottom here. When we first started doing this investigation, if you look on the screen here, you'll see price optimization with Eversight as a key feature. When we started asking about it, is this in stores? They deleted it and said that it wasn't from their website. So again, we don't know the extent of what this is, but certainly kind of raises additional questions that we don't have answers to at this point. And with that, I will turn it over to Grace, who will talk a little bit about the policy response.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. So I am Grace Getty. I'm a senior policy analyst focused on artificial intelligence at Consumer Reports. If you are based in the US, you might know Consumer Reports for our magazine, for independent product testing, but we also have a team of policy folks focused on consumer protection issues, and that's where I sit. So I'm going to briefly talk about how this investigation was received by policymakers in the US, and then some of the other legislative trends we're seeing in the US. So in the 2 weeks after we published these findings, I tracked at least 12 members of Congress who sent letters to either Instacart, the company, or to the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of the consumer protection enforcers and regulators in the US, and their remit includes US grocery stores. So senators, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senator Klobuchar, sent letters. We also put together a petition and a letter to the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general, calling on them to investigate Instacart and hold them accountable if they found unfair and deceptive practices. That petition received more than 40,000 consumer signatures, and one day after we delivered it to the Federal Trade Commission, Reuters, a journalistic outlet, reported that the Federal Trade Commission had launched a probe of Instacart in response to our findings. And then, as Eric mentioned, in late December, Instacart announced that it would end AI pricing experiments. And in January and February, there's responses from AG Letitia James in New York, who sent a letter to Instacart, and one from AG Rob Bonta in California as well, which is all very exciting. On the legislative side, we've seen a very dramatic uptick in interest in tackling this issue. So at the congressional level in the US, that's the federal legislative body, national legislative body, there have been several bills on this issue, one from Representative Tlaib in the House aimed at grocery store prices, and another from Rep. Khazar in the House aimed much more broadly at prohibiting surveillance prices and wages. There's another bill also from Senator Gallego in the Senate aimed at prohibiting surveillance pricing. But I think the area of intense interest is in the state capitals around the US, in part because of gridlock in Congress. It seems possible that this issue will get first tackled by the states. And as a previous presenter already mentioned, New York State has already passed one measure, a disclosure style measure. And, kind of to quantify the trends we're seeing, we did a little analysis and found that in 2024, there were no bills in US states directly tackling surveillance pricing. Last year, in 2025, we tracked 13 bills at the state level that either required a disclosure regarding surveillance pricing or a prohibition. And I don't have a number yet for 2026, but I think it'll easily top 20 or 30. Just a couple words on the types of approaches we're seeing at the state level. The prohibition approach rather than the disclosure approach seems to be the most common, though some bills do only require a disclosure. Another kind of different approaches that we're seeing, one is to kind of cover all goods and services. Some other bills only cover tangible goods or focus in on one specific sector, like grocery. And then lastly, some pair personalized pricing bans with provisions aimed at dynamic pricing. So I think there's kind of undeniable political energy around this issue in the US, and happy to answer any questions folks have about the legislative trends. And I think that's it from Eric and I.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this, and to hear also the interesting debate that I'm sure we'll have in the questions later about should we ask for disclosure, should we ask for a provision approach. That's certainly going to be, I guess, at the heart of some of the discussions. So without further ado, we're going to move to the last speaker of the panel, Els Bruggeman, who represents Euroconsumers, and I'll let you, Els, to introduce Euroconsumers to our audience who may not be familiar, to discuss what's happened in the EU and the approach that your consumer organisations have taken to tackle this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting Euroconsumers to this panel to bring also in the European perspective. For those who do not know us yet, despite what our name sounds like, Euroconsumers is actually a global group of national consumer organizations, national entities. We have organizations in Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Brazil, and recently we also opened a branch in Poland. They're all membership-based, they all receive the complaints, and this allows us to a little bit have a finger on the pulse of what is bothering consumers. And it also allowed us, as a consumer group, to be the first one in Europe to jump on dynamic pricing and really map out the experiences of consumers and also their expectations. I do realize that dynamic pricing, or whatever you can call it, is not as omnipresent like, for example, in the States, but it is knocking on our doors. We see the very first examples of it. And we believe it will be the new normal very soon, also in our European digital market. We have an expression in Belgium: when it rains in Paris, it drizzles in Brussels, and I'm pretty sure this is going to happen with dynamic pricing as well. Now, our big concern, obviously, as a consumer group is like, how can we make this work also for consumers? How can we make sure that it is organized in a fair and a transparent way? And there we have a bit of a double approach. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Because we feel that dynamic pricing can have a legitimate place in competitive markets. It can even be beneficial for consumers. It can smooth out demand, increase access to certain products and services, or increase price efficiency. But it needs to be organized in a fair and a transparent way. Just to point out where it can be beneficial. For example, if food is about to go bad or is about to go to expire, well, then it makes sense that you can adapt the prices so that you do not need to throw away all this food. Or, for example, in energy, when energy is cheap or is more sustainable because of solar panels, it makes sense to work with prices, so to incentivize consumers to actually use energy at that time instead of when it's more when it's not so sustainable anymore, or when it's more expensive. So it can have, pros and cons. It can be beneficial for consumers. The big question is, how do we make sure that it is organized in a fair and in a transparent way? And here we think there are some opportunities to clarify some things. In Europe, we're currently negotiating a Digital Fairness Act, which is basically updating our consumer law to the new digital reality. Well, dynamic pricing is a new digital reality. Of course, we do not start from scratch. We already have Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. We have basic consumer law. But we feel that, there are some opportunities to fine-tune it from time to time. For example, and our approach was, you can see the title is definitely maybe. It was indeed inspired by the Oasis experience that we had in the UK. So dynamic pricing, yes, definitely, or maybe it's, we need to assess carefully as a consumer organization. Either how, I think one of the things that we can clarify is that the purchase process needs to be well defined. And for us, it's a bit of a no-brainer that when you're in the buying process, prices cannot go up again. But also, just be very transparent when you're using dynamic pricing, not only when you're using it, but also how you are using it. What are the parameters that are being considered to change the prices? And you might even consider setting some limits, like a maximum. How much can it go up? And you can even consider some markets where it is not a good thing to have dynamic pricing. And I'll come back to that later. Just to say that, these clarifications we're asking, they do not come out of nowhere. They really come from real consumer experiences. And as I said already before, we have already consumer law, and we have been trying to test it, enforce it also based, test it to this new dynamic pricing reality. Can we go to the next slide? Just to give you a few examples of the things that our member organizations did. Last week, we had actually a big victory against Ryanair for different kinds of unfair commercial practices. Now, there was one thing where we didn't win, and it was exactly on dynamic pricing. Maybe it has happened to you before. You want to buy a ticket, it's in your basket, you're actually in the buying process, and all of a sudden it stops. And they ask you to restart the process because the ticket has increased in price during your buying process. Well, according to us, this was a form of dynamic pricing, and you cannot go up when it's already in your basket and you're actually doing the payment. However, here, Ryanair said, look, it's not dynamic pricing, it's variable pricing, what's in a name, and we don't use an algorithm, so it's okay. They just use cohorts in tickets. And actually, our authorities also looked at it. The authority in Belgium looked at it and said, look, according to the existing law, dynamic pricing as such is not illegal, so I cannot give you right here. That's one example. Another example is really going to the concert ticket sector, and where both our Spanish and our Belgian organization filed complaints against Ticketmaster. Well, the first one was actually OCU, our Spanish organization, for a Bad Bunny concert. Yes, before he was big, doing the halftime at the Super Bowl, he was already very big in Spain. And we saw when Ticketmaster was offering these tickets, they said that they could change according to market conditions, but it was not at all clear what exactly does this mean, how much could they go up, and what parameters they would use. So our organization filed a complaint with the consumer authorities, and we're still waiting for an answer there. Something similar but not identical, similar happened in Belgium, where we noticed that for certain concerts, Ticketmaster was offering platinum tickets. And they said, okay, they called it, somewhere in the conditions, they said, we use dynamic pricing. Actually, they said again, no, it's not dynamic because we do not use an algorithm. It is variable pricing. Again, what's in a word. But basically, these platinum tickets turned out to be just plain standard tickets where the price was adapted according to what they call the market conditions as well. So indeed, a form of dynamic pricing, although they deny it. Also here, we filed a complaint both at Belgian level and European level, and we are also still waiting for a response. But this really shows, I mean, these are the very concrete on-ground examples where we say, okay, if it's not clear for enforcers either, we can benefit from some clarifications in European law. Having that said, this whole issue about the concerts really triggered a more profound reflection on dynamic pricing in live events market, be it a concert or a sports game. And what we see there is that in this highly emotional, high demand markets where there is very little or no competition at all, well, dynamic pricing is not used anymore as a tool for market efficiency. It's just used as a tool to squeeze as much money out of fans and consumers. These live event sectors, traditionally, they are dominated or led by big single market players. As a consumer, as a fan, you can only buy that one ticket from that one seller for that one concert. You have no other option to go elsewhere. They hold all the power. And when we see in a market that is not functioning well, it's not functioning well. There's no competition. There's a market failure. It's not fair. Well, in this case, fair dynamic pricing, according to us, is not longer feasible. And that's why we have also been calling for a ban in the live event sector. And maybe we can go to the next slide. Sorry. Because if one player holds all the cards, he can, then when one player holds all the cards, then dynamic pricing stops working for consumers and starts working against them. There's no fair dynamic pricing anymore. As a consumer, you're just prone to the arbitrary will of one single player. It could be Ticketmaster, it could be someone else, and I'll come back to that later. But basically, you're being forced as a consumer to enter in some kind of a bidding context, first come, first serve, where prices only go up, they never go down. And a ticket can go from 50 to 500 euros and even more in just a matter of hours. And you do not get an actual extra service for that. I mean, you still have the same concert, you still have the same seat. The only difference with the person sitting next to you is that you pay 3 to 10 times as much. So that's why very concretely for the live event sector, we think a ban is justified because simply there is no competition. It is a failing market, so you cannot have a fair dynamic pricing system. Now, why does it matter for us, and why does it matter at this moment? Maybe go to the next slide. Now, of course, the reason for that is a market failure, but it's not fair to fans. It's not fair to fans because they are, their loyalty is being exploited. Like I said, you do not get more added value. And it squeezes out people, it excludes people from, priceless experiences that we think everyone should be able to have access to. And in the end, it also destroys trust in our digital market and even to the benefits of what dynamic pricing could also mean for consumers. And it's not like consumers are being unfair. They want to pay for a concert. They want to pay for the real cost that it takes to, and they know it takes a lot of money to organize a concert like that. So, and there might be price differences when you have a better seat or a different category, or you have a VIP package. But what we cannot expect and accept anymore is that, you know, consumers are just being squeezed out and to the, you know, to the level of the amount of money that they are willing to pay. Now, why is this very on top of mind right now? And that's maybe the next slide. Well, it's very top of mind because of FIFA. And here we see a very concrete example of what it means if one player holds all the cards. I mean, just before summer, FIFA announced that it would be using dynamic pricing. So immediately we were very concerned, and we were not alone because also Football Supporters Europe joined us. So we immediately reached out to FIFA saying, look, why are you introducing this? What is the benefit of what, or what could be the benefit for consumers? And what does it mean? Will you be transparent about it? What parameters will you use? How much can it go up? Will you include some kind of safeguards against, you know, excessive price fluctuations? Now, we did manage to get a meeting with them, and of course, I cannot disclose all the secrets, but basically, the main response that we got was, first of all, okay, it's not dynamic pricing, it's variable pricing. Again, what's in a word? Because we do not use an algorithm, we use cohorts. Although these cohorts are, you know, they use many, and they change very, very rapidly. So you could ask yourself, what's the difference with dynamic pricing then? They also said, look, I mean, the World Cup is being organized in the United States, and it's pretty much accepted over there. I don't know if that's the case. Maybe the colleagues of Consumer Reports can explain that. But they seem to forget this is a World Cup, and we would love also people from outside the States to attend a World Cup. And another thing they said was, another argument they used was, look, I mean, if we do not set the prices sufficiently high, then they will be sold on the secondary market for much more money. Basically, they were saying if someone needs to make profit, it's better we make profit out of it instead of the resellers. Of course, that doesn't change a thing for consumers that are just being squeezed out of attending their favorite national football club. I mean, and FIFA is a very clear example what happens if one big player holds all the powers, is able to pull all of the strings like a puppet master. And that's why we will continue to that way, both campaigning and considering other options. And just to wrap up, I want to show you this video, and I hope it explains in a very good way why we are doing what we are doing. Maybe yes. Valentina, if you could play.
When I was a kid, my dream was simple. Watch the World Cup live with my friends. To sit in the stands, surrounded by thousands. To feel the energy, the passion, the noise, a truly priceless experience. But now, dreams like that feel harder to reach. Prices change by the minute, and suddenly the game isn't just on the field, it's in the ticket queue.
Here he goes, lines it up, fires, yes! That's a goal! Absolute rocket!
Is this the real price of priceless?
Together there, and it's paying off. The crowd is on their feet, and you can feel the energy. Keep this momentum going. That's the kind of thing.
Great, thank you very much, Els, for your intervention and for that clip. So sorry, the little boy, all grown up, didn't manage to see what he wanted to see in real life. I think that's probably a good link to our Q&A session now, because having listened to everybody, and whilst you were talking, you generated quite a lot of interest in the room. So we've got a number of questions that have been addressed actually to all of our speakers, and obviously, Els, I'm sure yours are about to be typed since you were last. So I will perhaps just ask speakers in the order that obviously you intervened to answer the questions that you were posed, and then if we have time, I've got a few of my own, and we might explore those. So we'll go back to Matthias as our first speaker. And we've got a question from Pierre Horner, who would like to know on the point that you touched upon, algorithmic collusion and market power. You said that there is evidence that algorithms can collude between themselves. And Pierre would like to know what's the best current view, whether it's tacit coordination or explicit collusion, and what evidence would satisfy an enforcer. The question continues, could you please mention the case in the given jurisdiction that you came across for this case law? So Matthias, I'll give you the floor, and I know you've got some link that we are going to share whilst you answer.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the question. And I think the question is extremely interesting and relevant. And it's relevant for two reasons. So the concept of algorithmic collusion can be understood along two lines. So one line is slightly more conventional, I would say. So one concept of algorithmic collusion is describe the situation in which you have a third-party provider of the pricing algorithm that provides this algorithm in the same way, in the same form, for several firms in the particular sector of the industry. So this is something pretty common, for example, in the hotel industry, in some parts of consumer retail. So you have a third-party developer of software that sells the software to particular consumer-oriented, consumer-facing firms, and those firms effectively are able to provide the same pricing scheme, which effectively may lead to the collusion comparable effects. And this type of algorithmic collusion has been tackled already in the US in two ways. So first of all, we have the last year's amendment to the California Competition Act. This is the Cartwright Act. This amendment came into force this year, and this amendment explicitly prohibits using the third-party software in order to calculate prices in the way I described. Secondly, we have a case that I also asked Christina to share the link to this case. This is the case decided by decided last year by the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Ninth Circuit, and this is the case concerning exactly. So this is the Gibson case. I think this is the name you can find in references. This is the case where the plaintiffs accused the third-party software provider that provided pricing software to hotels for, again, colluding and raising the prices for consumers in the entire hotel sector. That was the individual consumer's claim, and the claim was dismissed because the Ninth Circuit concluded that this kind of practice is not yet enough to constitute the collusion. So you can see that we are still, at least in the US, we are still in this kind of like transitory period when we are trying to understand what is the definition of collusion and how intense this collusion should be in order to trigger the regulatory action. And the second type of algorithmic collusion is what I mentioned before, And here we have only some empirical evidence. We do not have yet litigation, at least the litigation I would be aware of, where the algorithms supplied by several providers just look into the prices calculated by another algorithm and where the actual price in the entire market sector is going up. But this is something we can see, for example, in some like big consumer retail, where clearly there is evidence that, for example, if there is an increase or decrease of price, for example, by the supplier of particular type of furniture, the price for the same piece of furniture, for example, available on Amazon or on some other platforms, also changes accordingly to how the algorithms employed by Amazon to calculate prices perceive the price fluctuation on the market. And again, this is something where we do not have yet any litigation. At the same time, I think the majority of voices in the scholarship agree that even like implied collusion, even like tacit collusion by, let's say, coordination of algorithms can at least raise substantive antitrust concerns. Is it like enough to trigger the regulatory intervention? We don't know yet. I would say that in some situations, at least, it should be, at least from my point of view, enough. But this is the answer I can give, at least at the current stage at which we are in the US. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We'll go straight to Simon Jones from the CMA, who also has a question that was put in the Q&A. So the question that's addressed to you talks about the UK study that was shared in the chats. And that study highlights that many businesses don't expressly tell consumers they use dynamic pricing, and that complexity or pressure can harm consumer decision making. If a developing country authority with limited capacity to audit algorithm was to tackle that problem, which intervention from your work are the best bang for buck? So you could guide us through what makes the most sense to do out of all the solutions you'd highlighted.
Certainly, Christine. And I think what I should say about this is that when we were thinking about this, we probably thought about it through the prism of existing UK consumer protection law. But it's certainly right that a lot of businesses don't tell consumers that they do dynamic pricing. And I'm talking here about dynamic pricing in the sense that I understand it, or that we have defined it, not really the way in which Eric or Els are thinking about it. But in our system, we have rules really that mean that consumers need to be able to take informed transactional decisions, and I think we say this in the note. And it is important, or it can be important, to know how the pricing model works. We did think about saying it would be helpful for people to understand how an actual dynamic pricing model works. When we started to look at it, we thought that probably wasn't right. These are sometimes extremely complicated, and it doesn't necessarily shed any light. And as I mentioned, there is a risk of informational overload to which people can be subject. But we did think that the following sorts of information are the sorts of things that we are going to inform people's transactional decisions, depending on the context. And obviously, there's a difference about whether you're buying groceries or whether groceries or buying train tickets or buying flights. But obviously, one could be a statement that prices can change and are not static. A second is an explanation of what makes prices change. And I think the one we say is, for example, if prices go up, the closer to a booking date the purchase is made. So I think that's probably quite important information. That helps people to plan when they want to make a purchase. And I think we also said possibly the range of prices, maximum and minimum amounts that people are likely to pay, so they can end up understanding whether or not a price can end up being too expensive and out of reach for them or not. So those are three important things. And I think we also said that whereas we have rules that prohibit consumers being misled where there's an invitation to purchase, then consumers need to know what the total price they're going to pay is. So if the price in what we call the invitation to purchase here is different to the price the consumer actually has to pay, then that may be unlawful. So I think this is very much the point about the price of a product changing after you've added it to your online shopping basket. So those are the sorts of things that we really thought of. But as I say, in terms of information, but those are very much seen through the perspective of our consumer protection law.
Great, thank you. And I think we're back to the problem of it's different jurisdictions, different laws, different definitions are clearly profiling themselves to be a little bit of bar to enforcement. So we're going to move on to questions that were addressed to our speakers from Consumer Report. Grace, so there was one for you, Grace, and one specific for Eric as well. So we'll start with you, Grace, since I've seen your camera pop up, which was to perhaps explain a little bit more about the experience of the prohibitions and the approach that is needed for a consumer protection agency in a developing country, again, to ensure that a prohibition would be effective. So I wonder whether you have any insights or any views on that and what the current discussions in the US might tell us about this.
Sure, that's a great question. I am admittedly situated in the US, and I've been thinking primarily about enforcement in the US context, but we'll do my best to extrapolate. So as I mentioned, we're seeing a couple approaches, primarily disclosure versus prohibition, in bills that are being advanced. In the US, no bill to prohibit personalized pricing. And I realized I should have been a bit clearer in my comments. Our Instacart research was kind of trying to look at the issue of personalized pricing, which I think of as distinct from dynamic pricing, but are sometimes both included in the umbrella term algorithmic pricing. So there have been many bills looking to prohibit personalized pricing within US jurisdictions. So far, none have passed, but it's also still a very early policy concept in most of these states. And pretty often we'll see in US states an ambitious policy idea does get kind of introduced and then considered for a couple of years before it may be passed or left behind. In terms of enforcement, the common approaches we are seeing in US states are to pair, enforcement from someone like an attorney general, which is a state level consumer protection enforcer who can bring legal cases on behalf of consumers, with a private right of action, so allowing consumers to sue on their own behalf if they've been harmed. And we'll see if any of these bills pass, what enforcement model is ultimately successful. One issue in the United States, and this may be the case in other jurisdictions, is that our enforcers are dramatically under-resourced. They don't have enough money or staff to enforce all the laws they're charged with enforcing. And this is especially important when it comes to these new pieces of tech legislation, which also maybe require some technical expertise in building the case. So that is an issue that I think is very, very important in the US when it comes to how companies think about their compliance risk. And so, I don't know what of that is most relevant to other jurisdictions, but I do think certainly including the ability for consumers to seek justice on their own tends to create a pretty strong incentive for businesses to comply because of litigation risk.
Great, thank you. And the question that was addressed to Eric is probably a little bit more technical. The question came from Francisco Freitas, who asked, can it be possible that the variations on price from Instacart be attached to a particular price, which is in fact the highest found in your investigation and not the lowest price? And the question continues. I guess my question is, do you find a clear reference price? So perhaps, Eric, you could take us back to a little bit of the content you covered to perhaps elaborate on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's essentially, right, so in our study, we found that 75% of all items had price variances in it. And the question, if I'm understanding the first part of it, is it possible that kind of the highest price there was the reference price or like the standard shelf price, and they're kind of testing around beneath it to see if a discount would increase? My answer to that would be, I mean, it is possible. I'm very skeptical of that. So Eversight, their previous advertising and kind of marketing towards retailers marketed, I believe, 3 to 5% profit increase and a 1 to 2% volume growth, which to me implies a price increase with a faster than volume, which implies a price increase. That being said, is there a clear reference point or price per item? It really depends on the item. So like certainly there were specific items where the bulk of the prices were one price, and then there were ones lower or higher. The good news is that Consumer Reports published all of the data. It's all publicly available. So if folks want to dig into it themselves and kind of slice and dice as they see fit, you can find it on GitHub, and I'm sure we can send that link over to include it in any of the presentation meeting documentation.
Great, thank you. And yes, can I remind everyone listening in that on the website of today's webinar, you have all the presentation and all the links and everything will be included there. So that will be a good reference point. We have a question for Elfs as well. You have not been forgotten. And the question is, in the context of your recent complaints and enforcement experiences, what were the most significant barriers you encountered in seeking redress or transparency? And what should enforcement authorities, do you think, learn from your experience?
Mm-hmm. I believe our experience shows that also enforcement authorities are struggling with dynamic pricing and how to address it. Like I said, we have a set of rules, general consumer protection rules in Europe, and it seems very difficult for them to apply this to this new digital reality, which is dynamic pricing, or you can call it variable pricing. The fact of the matter is that prices change rapidly, and that the digitalization makes it more easy, and AI will make it even more easier. So based on what we have right now, we have, of course, things about transparency. And of course, we can sue certain players for lack of that. But the question is, if it's transparent, will it also solve the problem? We see that that prices change so rapidly because of digitization is making it possible. That you create this level of scarcity, or at least this feeling of scarcity, and it's putting, very much pressure points on consumers to act rapidly, and especially like that in sectors where you have high demand and where there's an emotional involvement because you're a big fan or you're the biggest football supporter, and so you see, just by adapting prices rapidly, they push the pressure points. They exploit actually loyalty. And the question is it legal? Maybe according to existing law, and if they are transparent, you could say maybe it's legal. Is it fair? No, we don't believe it's fair. And that's exactly what in Europe we are discussing. We are discussing how should we adapt existing consumer law to this new digital reality, and let's call a spade a spade. The consumer environment, the business environment has changed dramatically because of digitization. It allows you to adapt very quickly to new realities. And also to exploit actually consumer vulnerabilities and consumers' pressure points. So that's what actually, basically, if you have a look at the Ryanair case, they said, look, basically the judge told us, look, based on existing consumer law, this is not illegal. And between the lines, he's actually saying, look, if you want to address this, you need to, fine tune some things in your consumer law. So I think, enforcement authorities are having the same struggle as we have, adapting or, using existing law to this new digital reality, and are equally asking for some, guidelines, clarifications for them to also to act and make sure that this new digital market is actually still a fair one.
Great, thank you. So we have many other questions, and I'm afraid we will not be able to cover them. If the speakers, perhaps, whilst I conclude, could look if there is anything left to answer in the box and answer in writing, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, can I invite you all to email the Secretariat, and we can pass on the questions and get some answers for you. So we have come to the end of this webinar. I'd like to start with thanking all of our speakers for some really fascinating insights into an area which is a really tricky one, as we've heard today. It certainly sits very uneasy with consumers. And yet there doesn't seem to be a good, ready package legal solution to tackle this practice. And indeed, I think dynamic pricing is an area which is interesting, because it's one area where everything collides: consumer protection, competition, and economics. And that makes things very tricky, I think, because it's also about deciding, where do we start tackling the problem? Is it a competition problem? As we heard, in markets where there is no competition, it's obviously even more problematic to see those practices develop. But from an economist's point of view, it might make perfect sense. It's actually a rational business maximizing their efficiency and the rents they can extract from consumers. And consumers are not forced to pay for the extortionate pricing. And yet, from a consumer protection perspective, it clearly looks like an unfair practice. Yet there are difficulties in tackling this. And I wonder whether actually the real problem is not the personalization, the variable pricing, or whatever way we call it. That has always existed, and indeed makes sense. A business should be able to adjust their pricing to make sure they're not selling below cost. A rising electricity bill might justify a rise in the cost of products. But perhaps what is problematic is the fact that this ability to adapt the price is now much more prevalent, but also much faster than it used to be in the past, and also at very little cost to the businesses who deploy them. In the past, you needed to send someone in a supermarket to take all the prices that the competitors were charging to be able to adjust your pricing accordingly. And therefore, maybe once again, the technology is a factor that exacerbates a problem that perhaps competition was quite content with in the past, but maybe should think of in different terms today. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their fantastic insights and work on the ground, and invite everyone to keep on following what the working group is doing. My thanks to Valentina for organizing the event and getting us all in the same room today. Valentina, do you have anything to add?
No, just to thank, of course, the speakers for their excellent contributions and our participants for joining us. And we look forward to continue this exchange in the working group. Please keep tuned to our next events. We are going to upload the video of this webinar to the website, and all the slides are going to be there too. So thank you very much, and nice continuation of the rest of your days, wherever you are.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great, and thank you to all of you.